Uh, Hello, everyone. My name is Liora Bielski, and I would like, on behalf of the Minerva Center for Human Rights, to welcome you here to our Zoom conference, Transitional Justice and the Crisis of Democracy. This conference is a very special event as it marks the end of the first year of our special grant by the Max Planck to promote the study and research of transitional justice in both the Hebrew University and Tel Aviv University law faculties. So, and in this grant, we have the first postdoctorals who are attending here, Limor Yehuda and Jeremy Barker. So welcome here. The idea for this conference began with a conversation. I think it was with Dr. Natalie Davidson, who is attending here today. And it led to a year-long reading group led by Dr. Natalie Davidson and Dr. Limor Yehuda, who is also here today. This group was a collaboration of the two centers in Hebrew U and Tel Aviv University. Initially, we thought of bringing into a conversation two scholarly debates that are rarely discussed together: democratic retrogression or crisis and transitional justice. As COVID-19 broke out, the link between the two fields became even clearer as both fields thought in metaphorical terms about how to cure or transition into a democracy or healthy democracy. Many of the participants in this conference were part of this reading group, and the papers, including mine, is the result of this fascinating discussion. COVID-19 also made the conference transition from the physical setting that it was planned initially into a virtual conference, but I hope that it only increased its relevance today. I'm looking forward to a 2 days discussion ahead of us and wish us all very good luck. Yes, so Tomer.
Thank you, Liora. Yeah, that's okay. So I have very little to say after that. I think that's an excellent introduction of what is an exercise. And no matter how much we've been working on Zoom and other online platforms in the last half year, then it still is it is a challenge. In any case, good morning, good afternoon. I'm Tomer Brody. I'm still the academic director of the Minerva Center for Human Rights, I think at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, hence my background, a place that I haven't visited for the last 6 months. But I like seeing the grass and the library. So welcome to everyone, and thanks for joining in. This is indeed a conference that's been a long time coming. There's been a lot of thinking and a lot of work. Liora mentioned some of the people, the main people involved. This isn't the way we would have wanted to have it. With a general overarching question, how does transitional justice, which has been intended to promote democracy, relate to the deterioration of democratic principles, something that I had several papers planned for this conference. I just can't wrap it all around, even in the last 24 hours. And there's so much going on in Israel, in the United States, in Europe. So it's very, very hard to keep a kind of focus. I think we have a stellar group of thinkers in the conference in general, definitely in the panel that I will soon present, also with a truly global outlook, which is something that from the get-go that we were thinking about and hoping to maintain. So thanks a lot to lots of people. This has been a cooperation between a rare cooperation between Tel Aviv University and the Hebrew University. we're miles apart, but also sometimes continents apart. And this grant from the Minerva Center, from the Minerva Stiftung, and the Max Planck Gesellschaft has certainly promoted that possibility. I'd just like to thank a few people. Liora, Rachel Kagsborn is also, everyone's here, I guess. Natalie Limol, Dani Evron, Or Avigai, who is the principal of our transitional justice program in Jerusalem, Jeremy Braca, who was also involved in the reading group, Anat Mishali at the Minerva Center, Liana, who's been, I think she's also there, but she's in charge of all the tech and will be involved, and also at the Max Planck Institute in Heidelberg, so Professor Ann Peters and Yulia Mtseva, who is the postdoc in Germany. So this is going to be a sort of kind of keynote session rather than having a keynote speaker. Each one of the participants in this session could have been a keynote speaker in a regular conference. So I'd just like to introduce briefly. So we have, and some of you I haven't met in person, I truly regret that. Samuel Isakharov is the Rice Professor of Constitutional Law at New York University School of Law, NYU, with many books and articles across issues in civil procedure, but also in constitutional law and democracy casebook and democracy unmoored, fragile democracies. One of the first people that we approached for this conference in any case. Ruti Teitel, in the context of transitional justice, really needs no introduction as a pioneer in the field, not just a recognized authority in international law, international human rights law, but really one of the founders of this field, and a professor, the Ernst C. Stiefel Professor of Comparative Law at New York Law School, and well, part of our team also at the Transitional Justice Program at the Hebrew University. Balakrishnan Rajagopal wears two hats now. When we first invited you, you had the academic hat as a professor of law and development at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, not an institution that we regularly host people from at law schools. But since then, you're also, since May 2020, you're also the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing under the United Nations Human Rights Council. Leslie Vinjamuri, looking for you because, well, Leslie, who there you are, who we've hosted several times also in persons, is a reader or associate professor in international relations at SOAS. The University of London, and also Dean of the Queen Elizabeth Academy for Leadership in the International Affairs and Director of the US and Americas Program at Chatham House. Sort of bringing in also lots of perspectives, not just from, well, from, you know, what Chatham House do. Let's put it that way. And Roberto Gargarella, who participated in one of our sessions in the reading group, lawyer and sociologist from the Universidad de Buenos Aires, doctor in law from UBA, and a master in law at the University of Chicago, and doctor in law at the University of Chicago as well, and also published numerous books and articles, including Legal Foundations of Inequality, this is from 2010, and perhaps important for the global perspective, Latin American Constitutionalism, Oxford University Press in 2013. So having said all that, and that was quite a mouthful, but I think we can start with Samuel. And the rules of the game are that it's like no more than 10 minutes, please. And even less if possible to get several main messages across, so we'll have time also for a second round of responses and also Q&A. So Professor Isakharov, please.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to participate in this. I regret that we could not meet in person. As Laura said, this conference brings together two themes which are implicitly linked but rarely discussed as divergent paths, and that's what I want to turn my attention to: convergence and divergence. So if we had held this conference 30 years ago, at the height of the optimism of the post-Soviet decline period, the transitions to democracy, not just in Latin America and in South Africa, but across the former Soviet bloc, the idea of transitional justice would have been heavily tied to the question of democratic stabilization. Transitional justice, as I understand it, and I claim no particular expertise here, is not simply a catalog of human rights assertions that can be made by individuals against the state, but rather incorporates the idea of stabilizing the bases of civilian rule and democratic governance. In some countries, that required extensive debates about the extent of human rights obligations, the extent to which the ancien regime could be held accountable. I note that 3 of the first panelists originally are from Argentina, myself included. In the Argentine view of the world, this is about right numerically, but it is the country that debated these issues more openly, with more anguish, and a debate on accountability that continues to this day, even while there has been tremendous dissensus and trouble in the consolidation of the post-military democratic rule in Argentina. And if we went back 30 years, what I think we would find is that the overwhelming sense was one of optimism. That is, there was a Whiggish sense of history that things were moving toward the better. The autocratic and totalitarian regimes of the 20th century had largely collapsed. Democratic governance was on the ascendancy. More people were ruled by freely elected leaders, more or less freely elected leaders, than at any time in human history. And the optimism guided the sense that as democracy stabilized, there would be more accountability for the past and more capacity to guarantee against those kinds of violations going forward. Jump forward 30 years and the picture is quite different. We are clearly in a period of democratic retrocession. We are at a time when institutions of democratic governance, ranging from simple questions of legislative supremacy, questions of the capacity to organize and present oneself meaningfully through political parties, the independence of the press, the independence of the judiciary. These are all under attack at present. And what is disturbing for those of us who focus on the democracy side of the equation is that the challenge comes not from outside, the challenge comes from within. And it comes from relatively freely elected leaders who have used the fact of election to consolidate executive-dominated forms of governance that have largely left in disrepair the ways in which democracies have functioned for the last several hundred years. I want to finish by offering an observation that is the key to the work that I've been doing recently, and that is, I believe that at bottom, there are 2 preconditions for democratic governance. And the first is that there must be a commitment to repeat play. If one wants to go into the language of game theory, the solution to every game theoretic problem, every prisoner's dilemma, is always iteration. In single shot play, no game can be resolved to the mutual advantage of the participants. And for people like Adam Przeworski and his collaborators, they define democracy in terms of two successful transitions in office, such that repeat play is a perceived guarantee by the population. To jump very current for a second, what was so deeply disturbing and shocking last night was that for the first time, we had an American president who disavowed a commitment, a question that asked him to commit to the concept of rotation in office, the ceding of power, the capacity of the winners to cede to the losers, and the losers of today becoming the winners of tomorrow. The second feature is that at the core of democracy is the prospect of elections, and elections means that the majority or the strong plurality must prevail. But that's half the issue. The issue is that they must prevail, but not too much. And so there must be institutional boundaries on what the winners of today can claim from the system, so that there is a realistic prospect of tomorrow, so that the losers today have state resources and other capabilities in order to effectuate a different agenda going forward. So my time is up, but let me just conclude by saying that I am uncertain what the concepts of transitional justice offer at this moment, when you see the same patterns of democratic retrocession taking place, not just in countries like Argentina, which still has an accounting to do for the dirty war, not just in countries like Brazil, where you still have the legacy of the military hanging over, but also in Britain, in the United States, in France, in Italy, where the claims of the prior regime are not so momentous as the fact that it's very hard to tell the difference between, at a certain level of detachment, between what is happening in Brazil and in India and in Turkey and in Hungary and in Poland and in the United States, even though these come from very different historic backgrounds at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samuel. I think that really sets the stage. I hope I'm not on mute. Yep, that has set a stage in the democracy side, but I certainly appreciate the first references to the transitions of the 1990s and the optimism, which has been retrograded, and also the reference to repeat games. I think we can move now to Ruti.
Hi.
Right.
Can you hear me? Yeah, great. So first, wonderful to quote unquote be here, and I want to commend both universities for their collaboration. I really hope that this will be the wave of the future, because there are wonderful research opportunities and people affiliated with both, and I look forward through the HU Friedgal program to collaborate in the future. I want to just pick up, it's interesting, Sam and I didn't talk before, but I really want to pick up with the distance from between today and 3 decades ago, which is how he began, and bring in transitional justice and the path that we've seen with respect to transitional justice over those 3 decades. And that is that, and of course I have to go quickly, that in the beginning when I wrote my book, which was 20 years ago, and marking that moment recently, we were talking about the context of liberal transitions, so one direction. And I was looking at the study of phenomena associated with those political transitions, as Sam mentioned. Transitional justice was associated with the liberalization, not always consolidated, as was mentioned, coming out of both authoritarian and totalitarian rule. But part of what we saw was the the impetus, and I would say that the most strongly consolidated countries, and this remains the case, engaged in constitutional change. And you can see a real difference between the ones that had just limited constitutional amendments or avoided it altogether. And so I think we can begin to discern differences in the kind of transitional justice we're talking about. But the structure of the story at that point was a hopeful one, as was mentioned. The structure of the story involved some knowledge or some amelioration, and the transitional justice took that form, that somehow the new knowledge, disqualification of some, a new community could be fashioned. And there was this idea, which now upon reflection may seem naive, there was somehow this view that regime change was equivalent to a broader sociological or societal change. So I want to pick up with that, because in recent years, we see a different relationship between transitional justice and political transition. And that is, we see an association between transitional justice and incomplete transition, or transition in fits and starts, or transition that's been interrupted. So places like in the Middle East, in Egypt, we've seen that. Fits and starts, I would say also in Argentina, a number of places where we don't see that linear account that we talked about in 3 decades ago. So what does that mean for transitional justice, this different context? And I think that, as I said, in the past, if you take something like South Africa, where they engaged in this, deep constitutional change, we viewed the regime change, the fact of the democratic successor, as connected to this broader sociological change. Transitional justice was embedded, where we saw it as embedded in constitutional transformation is where this was most true. But what if regime change doesn't itself produce sociological conditions for broader political transformation? How do you change the people? Okay, this was something Professor Martine Bomer raised in the blog exchange on my book that we had recently on Opinio Juris. We see this question confronted all over Latin America, but in other countries as well. And I think that this is really the question, one of the questions going forward is, what is the purpose? What is our theory about these ongoing processes of transitional justice and what they might accomplish in this context of incomplete transformation? Take a place like Colombia, where the first political democratically elected regime was very much in favor of transitional justice and in fact promoted it, like Alfonsín as part of their campaign. But now we have a different scenario. So this raises the politics of transitional justice. There were many, bureaucrats and global NGOs that committed to rules about transitional justice, notwithstanding the political context. We saw writing about duties, about the pillars of transitional justice. But I think we have to raise the question about this disconnect between transitional justice and political transition. Which brings me to the last 2 points, and that is this question of whether transitional justice is even possible without political transition. I have been among those most resistant to the expansion of the vocabulary, insisting that we can talk about transitional justice and in an anticipatory way, okay, so as not to lose all meaning in the term transition, or we can talk about transitional justice postponed. There's a dialogue, a conversation in the United States that's been brewing with the Black Lives Matter movement, the 1619 documentation. And then we have to ask ourselves if we have a theory about that the usefulness of transitional justice, as they now call it, those who advocate for it, bottom up, disconnected from prevailing political change. We've seen arguments and movements, campaigns coming out of the Balkans in this respect. They went through a variety of different mechanisms. They had the international, the tribunal, the regional tribunal, the ICTY, et cetera, But there are groups in civil society that write about the importance of this kind of initiative. They are emphasizing memory. The campaign for the RECOM, as it's called, Dr. Yavo Rangelov, with whom I collaborate, has written extensively on this. And this really raises this question of is it possible to think about the concept of transitional justice without political transition? What does it mean to deploy these practices, or even to raise a conversation about this? And I think the theory here has to be that it would promote change, some form of consciousness, raising consciousness in the society, but through this reckoning with the past or confrontation with repressive institutions that may even still be present in the current moment. Are there ways, better ways to do this? Are there ways to confront these past injustices? For example, in settler democracies, we've seen that in Canada and Australia. It's happening a bit in Israel, Palestine, right? Where the idea is outside of political change, can one help build some kind of social consensus about the past? And I think that this is part of the movement now regarding memory and regarding commitments to non-repetition. What I want to do, just to raise along these lines, and I'm going to end with this, is we might think of the avenue of education here. To what extent is the commitment to knowing the past and reckoning with the past part of a transition, a purpose towards non-repetition and this kind of educative side or pedagogic transitional justice? And, not, in keeping with the monopoly of Argentines in this area, I want to recall the late Carlos Nino, as well as late Ronald Dworkin's visit to Argentina, where he wrote about the trials, the torture trials. And I've written a piece for the London Review on this, where he wrote about the importance of having torture trials, not because of retrospective or retributive purposes, but rather forward-looking. And he talks. Nino talked about the epistemic value. Let's use a less fancy word, which is about the knowledge that would be garnered and would be disseminated in the population to understand the kind of decision-making and the path toward evil that the torturers, the junta made, so that we can know more as a society about our vulnerabilities going forward. And I think that, this brings us back to what we're doing here on the webinar, to the various programs in Israel, Palestine, at, Tel Aviv, HU, and Haifa, and other places, which is, that might be an angle we might consider going forward about what we're doing. I think we, might better understand this movement from civil society regarding, at the very least, this idea of promoting knowledge about the past towards, with an eye to a better future. I'll leave it there for now.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ruthie. Maybe I'll just, I'm not going to jump in substance, but I think there's lots of interesting questions, but, to what extent is the current crisis of democracy, is it about the past or is it about the present? And indeed the future, when younger people, younger than myself, they have also very little awareness of the past. In other words, it's not the first thing that younger people in their 20s think about, for better or for worse, and that perhaps is also one of the bridges conceptually between the understanding and education, certainly, of democracy and a lack of awareness of the past. Father Krishnan, do you want to jump in now? It's great to see you. We're hoping to host you, but
yes.
there you go.
Thank you. I'm glad to join this group. I think the general sense in the past was that democracies protect minority rights better. This is both due to the emergence of democracy as the leading form of government post 1989, and the sense that democracies also foster rule of law better. Massive violations of minority rights in the 1990s, and even in some cases recently, were indeed not in functioning democracies, and that witnessed the collapse of rule of law amid spectacular violence. I mean, think of Balkans and Rwanda, but also recently Myanmar. But on the other hand, recent evidence suggests that these easy assumptions are not well-founded anymore. Democracies have become particularly susceptible to violations of minority rights, as majoritarian regimes have come to power in democracies from Asia to Middle East to Latin America, Europe, and North America. These majoritarian democracies have indeed transitioned from more liberal versions to darker, more violent ones. So my question is, what about the rule of law? The past believed that democracies foster rule of law better. I will suggest that in these new majoritarian democracies, rule of law has been eroded and allowed to collapse, often partially, while systemic undermining of the rule of law is actively fostered as part of the majoritarian democratic project itself. This has happened in two ways. First, most worryingly, rule of law has been sacrificed in many of these new majoritarian democracies, as spectacular violence has selectively been used against minorities to discipline them, while the state stands by or actively aids and abets the violence. In this, the scenario is not a whole of society collapse of rule of law, like what we saw in Rwanda or the Balkans, which then turns into a civil war and the disintegration of the state itself very often. Indeed, the state remains very much in charge, and in much of the country, life goes on normally, while extraordinary violence is deployed against minorities in a contained area of the country, as we saw with violence against Muslims in Gujarat in 2002 in India. A second way that rule of law has been undermined in these new majoritarian democracies is more pernicious, beyond spectacular bouts of violence. In this, the consolidation of these new majoritarian democracies builds on and entrenches everyday forms of violence and discrimination against minorities, which has been largely tolerated or even encouraged by many, including those who are now worried and upset about the rise of majoritarian democracies in their own countries. The nature of this form of violence and discrimination is, as the Black Lives Matter movement has reminded us powerfully, systemic and hardwired into cultures and societies. It is my argument that the collapse of the rule of law in these new majoritarian democracies must lead us to think of these states as failed states and reckon fully with the consequences of state collapse and state failure. In particular, I will argue that what we have been witnessing in many of these new majoritarian democracies is a partial or planned collapse of the state. Now, the literature on state collapse tends to focus on the collapse of nation states as a whole. One thinks of Sierra Leone, Afghanistan, or Somalia are not partial state collapses. Instead of thinking about state failure and state collapse as all or nothing phenomena, should we ask whether there is a continuation of state failure or partially collapsed states? Partially collapsed states are too many to count, and I will desist from specific examples for now. A planned collapse of the state is a different matter. In this, the governance mechanisms are deliberately prevented from carrying out their duties by those who are responsible for governance, including political leaders and bureaucrats. Unlike instances of state failures, in these instances, the concern is not about the lack of state capacity. If anything, the state exhibits enormous capacity to inflict violence on targeted populations. In these cases, violence against minorities is usually premeditated, well organized, and carried out with the assistance and encouragement of the state. Police stand by, and judicial authorities do not use their authority under the law to deal with the violence. Mechanisms of suppression fail, and mechanisms of succor and help after the violence also fail. An example of planned collapse of the state again was in Gujarat in India in 2002, which saw extraordinary violence against the minority population. what happened in Gujarat was localized and was not the failure of the Indian state as a whole, but of a subnational entity, Gujarat, for a specific amount of time to enable the consolidation of a new majoritarian democracy. I will suggest that in the literature on transitional justice, as well as on state collapse and state failure, we do not have the conceptual and analytical tools that are developed enough to understand partial and planned state collapse. The TJ literature tends to usually cover scenarios that involve whole of regime or whole of societal transformations, which assume a complete state overhaul, often after state collapse or state failure across the whole country. But what we are seeing in these new majoritarian democracies is something different. How do we understand these kinds of phenomena? And is democracy the main and most effective means of dealing with both everyday violations of rights of minorities, as well as planned and partial state failures? I would argue that electoral democracy alone is not enough for this purpose. Instead, what we need is a strengthening of rule of law. Rule of law in everyday activities is important in discouraging the tendency of those who would like to take over governance mechanisms for perpetrating mass violence. Now, if rule of law institutions matter for minority rights, then how do we change and strengthen them? This is a large topic, and of course, can't go into any details here, but I will recommend that the reform of the functioning of rule of law institutions must pay due regard to at least 4 kinds of duties in protecting minority rights. These duties are often under-theorized and under-supported in international human rights law, but it is my belief that there is a need to focus on them as part of the effort to deal with the challenges posed by the rise of these new majoritarian democracies. First is the duties for building community. There is a positive obligation to build a community and reduce barriers between people on grounds of race, religion, ethnicity, and other factors. Secondly, there are duties for preventing violence. This duty, of course, springs from the constitutional role of the state as the executor of the rule of law and the protector of rights in the Constitution. Thirdly, there are the duties for containing violence. Once the violence breaks out, there is a duty to contain it. Again, it says duty of the state, again vested in the state at multiple levels of governance. Fourthly, there are duties for the post-violence remedies. There are important set of duties relating to what must be done in the post-violence environment, for which the transitional justice literature and experience of countries such as many that have been cited already, whether Argentina or South Africa and others could offer some examples to study. Truth and reconciliation processes are particularly relevant here and have been proposed in the context of systemic racism in the US, as highlighted by the BLM movement, as Ruti Tatel actually pointed out. These duties for post-violence remedies are both individual duties as well as duties of the state. I'll conclude now by saying that partial and planned state collapses have come to pose significant threats to minority rights in recent years as these new majoritarian democracies consolidate around new forms of invented identities. We should link the study of TJ and democratic transformations with the study of state failure and state collapse to better understand these dynamics, and by that to hopefully better protect minority rights. So I just stop there.
Thank you very much, Balakrishnan. I think maybe I'll introduce I think this idea of a planned collapse of the state as a reaction to transitions, not necessarily in India, and I know that your focus was on Gujarat, but it's something pervasive. The idea of an anocracy, some kind of combination of a facial democracy. It's not the state is collapsing; it's that the tenets of governance that democracy stands for are collapsing. The state is always there. In fact, it's probably even stronger. But just to sort of point that out, and of course the role of minorities and kind of fetishism of majoritarianism as opposed to democracy. In other words, and this relates, I think, to Rudy's point about education. And we certainly feel it here in Israel that democracy has been conflated with simple majoritarianism and not with additional the real principles of democracy. So thank you very much for that. And Leslie, you're up next.
Hi, thank you. It's really an honor to be on this panel with such distinguished colleagues. And it's really nice to see everybody. I have to say, I'm one of those who would love nothing more than to be in person with all of you, and especially to be in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And so it's, you know, I miss it, but this is really, it's just nice to see everybody. So thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm going to be really brief, in part because my head, I think, has been in transition for a couple of years. And so it was really helpful, especially to listen to Samuel, Rudy, and others give this context. The question, I want to give a couple of quick remarks in response to the question that Tomer posed to us yesterday when he wrote to us, which was, you know, what's happened in the 1990s and the 2000s, to what extent does that explain where we are today? And Rudy obviously gave us, as she always does, this extraordinary genealogy, which she continues to develop so insightfully. But I want to say one thing about that, and then something about the US. My background, of course, has very much been looking at transitional justice and international engagement on the part of the US, looking out and elsewhere. And as an American located outside the country, I was, like so many of us, brought very much into the debates about what in the world is happening at home in the United States on questions of democracy. So it's a transitional moment. And I would say in that I've followed the tide of the wave of international NGOs that have been doing this for some time. Whether it was Human Rights Watch that during the, I think it was during the global war on terror, decided to set up a US chapter and look back at America, or whether it was much more recently Crisis Group deciding to look at Rob Malley saying that they were going to set up a chapter to look at the possibility that there might be electoral related violence surrounding November's elections, and draw on the experience that they have from their deep expertise on this question across the rest of the world. So many of the scholars and activists and thinkers that have been engaged in questions of democracy, transitional justice, human rights have, of course, who are American or schooled in the United States, have focused our attention elsewhere and have come back home for all the reasons that Samuel mentioned. And I will say, I stayed up for the debates and I'm quite delirious as a result, in addition to being gravely upset by the whole thing. So to Tomer's first question that he posed to us yesterday, I think of that as, the backlash question. To what extent were the 1990s especially, but to a degree the 2000s, less so, something that in a sense engendered overreach on the part of the international community and has led to some sort of pushback in a variety of locations. And there are two things that stand out to me, and that's just, where was the locus of that pushback, or how is that pushback framed? And one is the sovereignty critique, right? That it's who has the authority to raise questions of transitional justice, and a lot of critique that we saw across Africa, we know the story, against, in particular, the International Criminal Court was, we own this, and this should be a question for us and not for you, and never mind the deep debates about delegating authority and all the rest of it. But the sovereignty critique and partly the post-colonial critique emerged quite a long time ago, but I would say very interestingly remain very prominent and have become even more prominent in the so-called West. Which is, of course, one of the most interesting parts of the story, but also are very prominent in China. And we haven't talked about China, and I think we need to talk about China. I'm sure a lot of people are thinking about China, and certainly Secretary Pompeo is thinking about China, and the United States is thinking about China when it comes to questions of human rights, certainly not about transition. Secondly, the second prominent critique, and it's very general, but that I think emerged throughout the 90s and 2000s, which remains very prominent, but was something that I, for one, and many others looked at in the rest of the world, was that transitional justice had been captured by the state, that it was an elite project, and that the remedies failed to be inclusive, were sectarian in their capture, and exacerbated questions of inequality. And here I'm thinking about whether or not the move to thinking about economic and social rights ever really succeeded in the Arab Spring, in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. And those questions, right, are incredibly formative and foundational in the US context right now. So the US has taken and embodied these two fundamental critiques that emerged out of the 1990s and 2000s of transitional justice, that sovereignty and authority question, and that capture question. And they are forming a lot of what's going on in the United States right now. So the international critique that the US has of, pushing back against everything. Of course, it's not new. It emerged very early in the story, was very prominent, but now is pervasive in terms of pushing it back against the ICC and other forms of international authority. But internally, the critique that's being fostered by the leadership, but has gained a lot of traction domestically, that the elites in the state have failed to be inclusive, whether it's on questions of socioeconomic inequality or race and racial exclusion and racial injustice. So it strikes me that there are just a lot of very interesting parallels. And I guess the question that I'm thinking about, two questions, and I'll just put them out there very quickly. One is, given the context of America's challenged global moral authority, which is a very old story, is it uniquely different in this period or not? So the question is the domestic context that Samuel and others are talking and reflecting on and enlightening us about, and through the empirics of everyday life, not least the debates and President Trump's declaration last week as well on live television that he wouldn't necessarily accept the outcome of the election. Does the domestic context of America's challenged democracy further undermine its ability to provide some sort of role modeling or example that bolsters transitional justice in other places? Or was that always a fiction? And was that hypocrisy always many layers deep? And then secondly is the geopolitical context. What is the significance of the fact that we are now very clearly moving headstrong into a geopolitical conflict between the United States and China that might have begun as being something that was perhaps by intention, by the President of the United States intention, aimed to be transactional, has now very clearly moved into a confrontation that is ideological, that even with a new election, a new president is likely to be very values-based, with democracy and human rights at the forefront of that. What does that global context mean for human rights, for transitional justice, when you're talking about two major superpowers or great powers that have very different but very significant human rights problems at home, and in which the question of transition, to get to Rudy's long-standing critique of what happens when the transition is divorced from the justice, either because there is no possibility of a transition or because the transition has already taken place, but it was not fully inclusive. So what happens when you have the US and China, two major powers, setting the context for the international stage, in which it looks like those deep unresolved questions are not equivalent, and I wouldn't claim that they are, but are at some level intractable, endemic, and potentially irresolvable. And I'll just stop there.
Oh, thank you so much, Leslie, for bringing in the key geopolitical issues, I think, of the age. To simplify, transition to what? If the US was a model, perhaps in the 1990s, now perhaps a failed model. Maybe not in China, because for China it never has really been a model, but certainly in Central and Eastern Europe, and in other parts of the world. So last but not least, from Latin America, perhaps a different perspective, the home of transitional justice. Umberto.
Thank you so much. I'm also very happy to be here, and I'm so sorry not being able to be in Israel. I was really looking forward to that. No, the two topics, as it was said already, they are extremely important, and it's very difficult to put them together. So in only 10 minutes, I make just a 2 cents collaboration to the discussion. I will say one thing about the literature on democratic crisis, and then one comment about transitional justice. So basically 3 points. First, I think we dedicate lots of energy, and I think too much energy, perhaps, in the 20th century to the crisis of rights. No, and this, of course, had obvious and significant reasons. Nazism, fascism, in Latin America, the massive violations of human rights. So, for good reasons, we dedicate all our intellectual energies, I think particularly in the area of the law, to think about rights and think about Convention of Human Rights, human rights treaties, litigations of human rights. That's extremely important. But I think that it's time to start concentrating more energy on what is the crisis of democracy. So it doesn't mean to abandon our concern for rights, but to put a more serious focus on the crisis of democracy. About that, I want to make just one point. I think that the dominant literature, and Samuel was mentioning, for example, Adam Przeworski or Professor Tom Ginsburg. I mean, the literature on democratic erosion, and I think is making a very important contribution, asking us to pay attention to the basement of the system of checks and balances. But I want to say something about that. I think they are conflating the problems of constitutionalism with the problems of democracy. So again, I don't think that the main issue today, or the only issue, or the primary issue, is a crisis of the system of checks and balances. Of course, we see it everywhere, in the United States, in Argentina, in Mexico, everywhere. Of course, we know that strong executives in Latin America, we have a 200 years of history of concentrations of powers in the executive. We know very well that strong executives tend to to affect the system of controls from inside. But I think that the main problem still is another. It's a problem not so much related to the old traditional questions of checks and balances and constitutionalism, but a problem of democracy, in the sense of the inability that we as citizens have for deciding, controlling, making our representatives accountable, participating, debating in public, etc. So I would underline that we should start focusing first on problems of democracy more than problems of rights, which are still there. And then when we focus on democracy, not paying so much attention, or not only thinking about the old traditional problems of checks and balances, but the problems of the lack of opportunities that our institutional systems give us as citizens to control, to decide, to participate, to debate. So I have been thinking the notion of democracy from not a minimalist understanding of democracy like Adam Przeworski or like Tom Ginsburg, but from a more robust perspective, in line with what Ruti called, the epistemic notion defended by Carlos Nino, for example. I call this an approach of democracy that I call a conversation among equals. So for me, the law should be constructed should be the result of a conversation among equals, and that means the center should be in the citizenry. And I want to give one example, because I have no time, one example related to transitional justice, about the importance of deciding in line with a conversation among equals, and not deciding from powers that are concentrated, decisions from above, even when they are just. Even when they are just. We don't want and we don't need decisions from above, but we need decisions that are the result of a conversation among equals, even though we may disagree with that. So my example includes the cases of how Argentina and Uruguay have been dealing with the problems of transitions to transitional justice. For many people, Argentina is an exemplar, a great illustration of the trials against the junta. Of course, I collaborated into that with Nino. I participated into that, and for me, that experience was fabulous. But I think that if you take the long of what we did in Argentina in terms of transitional justice, is the going back and forth, up and down, and lots of decisions imposed from above, beginning with a self-amnesty given to themselves by the military junta before leaving power, then the trials promoted by the first democratic government by Alfonsin, which were historic, magnificent. But then again, I mean, amnesty, indults, full, I mean, many different laws trying to prevent the trials. Then the contrary, then again from above. No, all the amnesties, they were null. All the pardons were invalid. So lots of decisions in one direction and the contrary, but always from above. Below, there was the citizenry mobilizing and trying to do something different. But again, what we got were good, nice, or bad decisions from above. In Uruguay, the decisions included centrally an amnesty law, what they call an expiry law. And I, of course, in terms of the content, I don't agree with that. But the process was fantastic, I would say, because it was a product of a long-standing conversation, an ongoing conversation that's still going on. And it included not only decisions by the parliament and the Supreme Court, but also it included 2 plebiscites, 2 popular consultations. I, in person, because I defend the view of a conversation among equals, I'm not a fanatic of popular consultations if they are not doing the popular consultation in the right way, meaning information, discussion, conversation. But that was the case in Uruguay. Lots of people in the streets, lots of people participating, people writing articles in the newspapers, speaking in the television. And then the 2 popular consultations were the result of this long-standing process of conversation. Unfortunately, in both occasions, the 2 popular consultations, something unique in the history, they were in favor, in one way or another, in favor of the amnesty. So I don't like the content, but the process was fantastic because it mimicked the idea of a conversation among equals. Unfortunately, the main American court, the Inter-American Court, in a decision that for me was shameful, decided in the Hellman versus Uruguay case that the process was against the law because you couldn't, as a country, give an amnesty. Well, I would say we as a society, we have the right to discuss our tragedies in the way we can, in the best way we can. And if we do this in a way that includes all the possible different viewpoints in a long conversation, well, we need to be respectful of that. So I have been very much against how the international law have been dealing with this decision, which was a decision that in the content I didn't like. So just to summarize, I think that we should start paying attention more and more to democratic problems, thinking about democracy not, as it was said before, in a simple majoritarian way, but also not in the old minimalist understanding. I propose a view of democracy as a conversation among equals. And the more we approach to that, the more respectful we have to be with what we decide as a result of a conversation among equals. In Uruguay, I think that the conversation was magnificent, very close to the ideal of what is having a conversation among equals. In Argentina, in a way, I like better the result, but I don't like the process. It was not the process of a long-standing conversation, but it was a succession of imposition from above. Sometimes I like it, sometimes I don't like, but that's not the point. The point is about democratic process, democratic conversation. So that would be my 2 cents.
Well, much more than 2 cents, Roberto, and I think it also wraps around nicely to Sam's earlier mention of repeat games or iterated games, that a lot is about the process. Let's take a sort of a relatively quick round of maybe responses to see how, like I said, it's a bit eclectic, lots of different perspectives. Sam, are you there? Yes, you are. Do you have any sort of responses for a few minutes, and then we'll just go through all the panelists?
Yes, let me, at the risk that there's too much consensus, let me introduce some dissensus into the conversation. I was particularly struck by Balakrishnan's invocation of the problem of majoritarian democracy and its juxtaposition to Roberto's view of popular discourse and consultation. I think that one of the difficulties that we never really grappled with in the past, and now is in the forefront, is that when we were talking about the regimes that collapsed at the end of the 20th century, what were we addressing? We were talking about the Soviet tyranny. We're talking about apartheid in South Africa. We're talking about military regimes in Latin America. In each of these circumstances, you could correctly describe this as the tyranny of the minority. And the tyranny of the minority was a group that had captured state power and was able to bludgeon the democratic aspirations of the majority and then engage in a series of human rights violations and different kinds of degradations of the society. And you can go from country to country, and that was the template. And what is distinctive in the world today, and this was, I want to use slightly different language for Balakrishnan's point, because I'm not sure about the failed state analogy. What's distinctive is that we are now confronting the ultimate democratic nightmare, which is the tyranny of the majority. And the tyranny of the majority was Tocqueville's phrase, it was Madison's nightmare. It is the problem that if you don't have a supervening authority, what is to keep the group that is in power today from saying, number one, there will be no further accountability to you, and number two, I will do with you as I will. And that's always been the backstory of democracy, or the nightmare scenario in democratic governance. What are the counters to that? Well, first of all, and very strongly after World War II, it was constitutionalism. Second, it was having an independent court, usually a constitutional court, able to say to the majority, you have transgressed, you have gone beyond the bounds of what is acceptable, and we're going to restrain you. And third, it was all the other institutions of civil society. And Roberto's right, we shouldn't get overly formalistic about separation of powers, but separation of powers is a shorthand for fractionated power so that you do not have concentration of all decision-making and all authority in the momentary majority. What we are seeing now is the collapse of constitutional restraints in country after country after country, whether there's a formal constitutional amendment process as in Hungary, or whether it's done by the accretion of legislative or executive powers as in Poland and as in India. And second, you're seeing the collapse of the constitutional court system. These are being captured institutions. They are failing in every country, in Eastern Europe, certainly. And then what you're getting after that is the systematic assault on civil society. But what it unleashes is not a new tyranny of the minority. Unfortunately, these are wildly popular regimes. Vladimir Putin, if he ran a clean election today, would probably garner 70% of the vote. He is extremely popular. He has some mania that he has to garner 80%, so he has to hold fraudulent elections. I don't understand this. Why isn't 70% enough? It would be a dream of an American president to get that much. But you see it in country after country, the rise in popularity again of Bolsonaro, the overwhelming popularity among the majority sector of Modi in India. These are tragedies for democracy. And I fear that the language that we developed, and here I go back to Roberto's point about the over-focus on rights claims, the language we developed is primarily a language that emerged from the tyranny of the minority. I do not know that it translates well into a period where the primary concern is the tyranny of the majority.
Excellent. Rudy? We're collecting, just so you'll know, we're collecting questions also on the chat. There might be a technical blockage there, but we'll try to unblock it.
Okay.
Rudy?
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to check. Okay. So, yeah, I just wanted to react to one or two things. Obviously, very rich panel, lots of different directions. So one is that we can see the role of presidentialism and slash leadership, and that is that, Leslie was talking about, and Sam just invoked several instances where it was about the power of the president, and so we're thinking about Trump in the United States and Putin in Russia. There's a lot of literature about the risks of presidentialism, even within constitutional systems, and I think that we're seeing that in the United States today. By the same token, if Biden wins in November, and if we have a transition, then Biden has invoked the civil rights marches as part of American values, and we will see a different tone. So I am not, and I think actually the desperation we saw yesterday suggests that the handwriting is on the wall about the results of the election. So, this is the thing, is that when, we saw leadership with Barack Obama on these very questions of reckoning with the past, this is something I'm writing about today, it really matters who's the president because of the risks structurally of presidential democracy. So, this has been, as Roberto said, a vulnerability in Latin America. And for a long time, the US tried to think that it was exceptional, that there was American exceptionalism with respect to presidentialism. But boy, what a difference political leadership makes. And on that point, I would also raise this question about, respond about China and about the human rights discourse, which has been raised by a number of speakers. I'm for the U.S. adhering to a human rights discourse with respect to China. I actually think that insofar as he ever mentioned that and went non-transactional, that Trump was right. China's not like the Soviet bloc. Its interference and interventions in Latin America and in Africa have been much more commercial and transactional. They have tended not to be ideological. So it's very important that we push back with respect to their treatment of Muslims, et cetera. And this is actually one of the places that human rights discourse can be most useful, is where it's coming from the outside. It's a discourse that allows cutting through other political, it's a response outside of the system. It's, we have a different treatment of Islam in this country. We have a long tradition of presidents speaking about religious tolerance. Even George Bush Jr. at the time of 9/11 was very proud to say that we are not persecuting Muslims. So I actually think that this is something that this is an easy easy one for us. And I would say not to throw out the human rights discourse. There are places where it can be most usefully deployed, precisely because it's atomized and disconnected from often from local politics. So those are the places where I think we can do better. And I think Helsinki Watch was a perfect example that, in Helsinki Watch was using this language of rights talk against the Soviets. It was, yes, there was the arms race and so forth, but it was a way to delegitimize what the Soviets were doing once we had our, straightened out our backyard after Brown v. Board and other, efforts to address segregation. But, I just want to end on that note that I think that, and, the last point I wanted to make was about inclusion. And I think that, and here it's also an optimist note, which is that if the result of these marches and of the attempt to rectify our healthcare system and our economic, the absence of any kind of social welfare security in the United States, if there is a result, again, it would depend who wins in November, but I think even a change in the Senate could result in gains here. Then we will look back on this period as a period of disruption and ferment, but one that moved in a more positive direction in the United States. We have a very different system than Europe and Israel with respect to healthcare and certain, access to education. So these are long-term problems that needed rectification. They may not have affected those on the panel, but they are really issues that have long needed addressing and vocalizing in the US.
Great. Yeah, we have about 15 minutes and I'm collecting questions. Some of them you might be able to see from Daniela, maybe Jeremy. Next, Balakrishnan.
Yeah. Well, we have a lot on our plate already, so I don't want to throw more on it. But just a couple of things, just reflecting on what other people have said. One of my earliest jobs was I started with the UN with the peacekeeping mission in Cambodia. Which was, again, one more country that was expected to transition through the peace agreement into a democracy. And of course, there was the transition that was expected that it should go through to become a market-based system as well. The reason I mentioned that is that the geopolitics question which was raised, I think is very important, because the geopolitics of transition, the way we thought about transitions for countries like Cambodia in the 90s was very different. And the key difference was there was something called the role model. When you could think about transitions, you could think about some countries being the role models, and whether or not they're 100% perfect, you sort of said, well, what do you want us to transition to? And then the advice was, well, take a look at the practices and the laws of other countries, and then you could draw on a select number of countries. And they didn't all have to be Western countries. Certainly, there were non-Western countries that were quite admirable in their policies. In Cambodia, for example, we looked at the policies and laws of Sri Lanka or India, neighboring countries that had done quite well in creating functioning systems on health and education. Sri Lanka's successes on the education front are well known, for example. But the problem right now, especially with the rise of China, with the question that has been posed, is that China presents a geopolitical alternative, the likes of which we haven't seen before. And I see it as a practicing human rights lawyer that, it does sort of create a very alluring model, a role model, which is completely different, an alternative role model to the one that has traditionally been drawn on, models that are based on variations of liberal democracy mixed with varieties of capitalism of a certain sort. So that is that one issue. The other issue that I think is basically quite different from the 90s to now is the role of the judiciary. In the 90s, there was a great expectation that the transition to a better future, whatever it is, involves creating courts, constitutional courts, as Samuel Issacharoff mentioned, and essentially the idea that you could create an independent judiciary and create a professional, judiciary was seen as one of the key sort of, ingredients in the recipe for transformation. But on the other hand, the problem has been that in the last 20 years, there has been perhaps an over judicialization or over concentration of power in the hands of both the judiciary as well as a shift in power from the legislature to the executive. For example, in the United States, the growth of the presidency, for example, combined with the question of, the increasingly less robust functioning of the legislature, there is a shift in the balance of power between the legislature on the one hand and then the executive and the courts on the other hand. And there is a lot of disillusionment with the role of the courts, particularly the way they've consolidated themselves into an executive arm of the state. In India, for example, there is a great deal of dissatisfaction with the role of the courts today than it was, for example, even in the 90s. So I just want to put that on the agenda in terms of one of the issues to think about.
Okay, quick responses maybe from, we have a number of questions that I'd like to float. Maybe I'll mention them now. I think they're also en point for Leslie and Roberto. Some more specific questions about Eastern Europe. Why is Eastern Europe less part of the discourse? And also about whether monist countries have been faring better than dualist countries. This is an international law perspective. And then for Ruti and others, I think, so what are the next challenges for transitional justice? I think that's perhaps such a broad question that we'll have to leave it for the rest of this evening or morning, depending where you are, and for tomorrow. Leslie. I put you on the spot, but,
no, it's okay.
Go ahead with your own
I was going
point.
to answer Julia's question and then just one quick response to Ruti. I thought Julia's question about whether when the state doesn't step in, is that, private actors are stepping up, and does that sort of fill the gap, or can it fill the gap? And it is an empirical question, clearly, but my quick answer, and I'm no more qualified to answer this probably than you are, Julia. But it strikes me that the obvious problem is a legitimacy gap. But, in the world of pragmatism and alternatives, perhaps it's the best step, but I tend to be a little bit skeptical. I wanted to just comment quickly on two things that Ruti said. One was about, presidents, the question of presidentialism and, Biden's back. And I don't think I have a clear view on this, but I do, question mark. One thing that I'm hearing a lot from people who would define themselves, Americans, as deeply part of the resistance, very progressive, engaged in the protests in a very particular way, is that while obviously in their view, Biden is the better alternative, they see if Biden wins, that is actually not good for the resistance. And I think that kind of touches on a broader question of, of kind of capture, and is there the level of change that maybe you indicated there might be just by virtue of a president who is more sympathetic and more inclined, because obviously we know so many things are structural and difficult to change. And then my second comment is, it's on the China question. So, the move from transactionalism to injecting human rights into the discourse is something that I think many of us welcome, but it is being done in a particular way. I don't know how many of you probably have, Ruti. I admit that I have not yet read the full report by the Commission on Inalienable Rights, which obviously talks about China and talks about the surveillance state, and that's a particular way of injecting it into the discourse. And so the question is, it's the pragmatic question, putting the human rights discourse out there, but, you know, to go to Tomer's question of yesterday, what is, you know, what does it engender a backlash, or does it engender some other kind of politics? And then secondly, the other language, apart from the human rights language, that of course is something that Vice President Biden talks about a lot, is the Summit of Democracies, right? It's putting the global, it's, you know, it's not the UN, it's not the open church, it's not the great powers, it's the democracies. It's a similar idea that the UK government has talked about, is getting behind the D10, you know, so putting the democracies in an exclusionary way behind the China question. I mean, what, you know, what are our reactions to that? Is it necessarily a good thing? Does it necessarily move the dial? I mean, I think these are the same debates in new clothes as we've had for a very long time in transitional justice on the question of pragmatism and sequencing.
Roberto, and then we have questions from Jeremy and Daniela, who I'd like to fit in to our time frame. Roberto.
Yes, can you hear me? Yes. No, I want to disagree a little bit with what Samuel said, because I really think there is an important disagreement, because where he sees problem of excess of democracy, I wanted to say that I was seeing the problem in the opposite way, as an absence of democracy. So the absence of opportunities for most of us to talk, to have a dialogue, to have a meaningful dialogue. So our constitutions, which all come from the United States constitutions, don't give us but just one single institutional tool to do everything, which is a periodical suffrage, periodical vote, with only one vote that we cast every 2 years, 4 years, 6 years. We have to say everything we want to say about the past, about all the policies of the past, about all the politicians that were occupying public positions in the past, about all we want them to do in the future, about all possible alternatives that they haven't been taken into account, about their omissions, about we have to praise them, we have to say no, we have to suggest, and we can't, we simply can't. That tool is totally insufficient. So take Bolsonaro, take Trump, take whoever you want. For most people, they have to conflate all their demands in just one. So most people say, well, I mean, with all this just single tool, what can I do? So, for example, I want this economy to stay in place, but I would like to, them to stop corruption or to stop this superficiality or whatever. No, you have only one vote. Well, I do what I can, but that I cast this vote in favor doesn't mean that I in favor of all the stupid things that this guy is doing. So last elections in Argentina, most people wanted, I would say, the vast majority wanted at least two things. One, change the economy orientation, and second, stop corruption. They couldn't say, because if they were voting in favor of an economic change, it seemed that they were voting in favor of corruption. And most people would say, no, don't misunderstand me. I want to vote for an economic change, but I don't want corruption to come back. Oh no, you have only one vote. If you say yes, you say yes to both things. So that is what I call a democratic extortion. So Evo Morales, he put a 444 constitution in a referendum. Well, people have one vote. A reasonable person may say, I love all these new indigenous rights, but I don't want at all your re-election. No, you have only one vote. Well, I really, really, really want the indigenous rights, but I don't want your re-election. No, one vote. Okay, I vote for indigenous rights. You like my re-election. So that's a democratic extortion. So in order to vote for what I want, I have to give support to what I repudiate. So in those conditions, the problem is our lack of opportunities for a conversation. So, and it's not excess of democracy. It's a lack of democracy, lack of opportunities to control, to discuss, to give nuances, to say, yes, this, yes, but not this, and I want this other thing that you forgot. No, only one vote. So in that sense, we need to recover the opportunities for a conversation among equals.
We're almost out of time for this session. Very spirited discussion. I knew this would be an all-star panel. Maybe we'll take, I don't know, maybe you can pose them as comments and questions, because this is really sort of collecting thoughts, and we've collected lots of things online as well. Daniela, if you have like 2 minutes, and then Jeremy.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I had I was, as Roberto and Ruti were speaking, I was connecting some of their thoughts, Ruti's thoughts on, the fact that regime change doesn't necessarily lead to the type of sociological change that yields different politics after a period of transition, and Roberto's thoughts on democracy as a conversation among equals. So I posed essentially a question to Ruti to ask her to comment on what Roberto was speaking about, if the type of democratic mechanisms that he's speaking about are something of what you had in mind. Does that address the problems? And then sort of the secondary question off of that was relating to if the goal, given that it hasn't worked quite in the way that we thought, is still liberalization, or is this just a problem of not quite the right process to reach that same goal that we still have, or does that mean something in terms of the goal needing to be different?
Jeremy?
My question, but I think it's something that perhaps would capture the imagination of all the panelists, but specifically I was wondering whether we could have an engagement with the the COVID-19 curveball, and whether, when we're thinking about both regime change and social change, whether in fact this pandemic has either deepened the democratic crises that we've seen, or whether in fact there's some kind of game change. Because on the one hand, what COVID-19 has done is it has, in some cases, given the executive the excuse or the pretext to erode more democratic norms. But at the same time, what we have seen from Israel to the US and to Brazil is a real populist backlash against what seems to be populist leaders that are ill-prepared to govern their regimes. So whether it's a regime change potentially in the US, or whether it's social change in Brazil, I'm just interested whether transitional justice has a response to what we're seeing as the unfolding crises and public health difficulties emerge, and whether we see the COVID-19 as something that is in fact creating more tensions between our field, transitional justice, and democracy.
Tomer, do you think we could do one line, everyone one sentence, or? I don't know what happened there. Hello? Is it over? Okay.
Give your sentence, Ruti. We're waiting.
Okay. Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
For everyone.
No,
Tomer's battery.
I just thought everyone could. Okay. So just in response, and there were several questions along these lines, I do relate and embrace what Roberto Gargarella spoke about. I think that the mass marches reflect, I mean, this is really, populists' last gambit, right? Is that where there's no other way to express. So I think what we're seeing with these mass marches is exactly that, the failure of other approaches to more opportunities for citizen participation. So I like that. I like the dialogic. I think the reason I think that Biden's approach is better is that he has taken in the progressive arm. He talks about, their policies have been crafted with many commissions, in a number of different policy areas. he spoke about this being for you, not about him. So he was really taking the position that this is for the voting citizenry. And I think that on these other sub questions about religious rights and about other areas, or what do we mean by liberalization, I think we have to be very careful about the instrumentalized use of religion now vis-a-vis, for example, China. And that's what I see with that commission on inalienable rights, is it's a lot of emphasis on supposedly American rights are religion rights. And I think we have to be very careful about the instrumentalization of rights, precisely because this goes to legitimacy, right? And if they're seen as being used in a faux way, only in one direction, this will be a problem. But anyway, I think that what we have here is an unfinished dialogue, and I embrace that my genealogy was always about that. It was not about it being a fixed response to a particular period of time. So I really enjoyed hearing this exchange, and I think that probably there will be not only more in the subsequent panels, but also in the days and years to come. Thank you.
Tomer lost his connection, so why don't we really continue with everyone just adding one last sentence, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry for that. Battery ran out. And I think one lesson we've learned in this last session on the operational side is that there are lots of interventions and questions. We'll try and collect them so that also in your free time in between sessions, because we definitely all need a break. At least I think we do, not just my battery. Then we'll try and find a tech way to collect them so we can continue the discussion to sort of fertilize the discussions later on. But I literally blacked out for about 3 minutes, so I don't know if
you want us each to take a sentence in summary, or do you want to just stop?
One sentence, yes, for everyone, I think.
I don't think any of you can take one sentence, but you can try. It will be a challenge. Go ahead.
Okay, so let me go first. My general tendency, to quote Vice President Biden, is to throw flames on the fire. But let me offer a little bit of an olive branch to Roberto. The question is not whether the franchise standing alone is a protection of democracy. No serious person thinks it can be. And the United States intervened around the world in the 90s and 2000s under the idea that all you had to do was have one election one time and you had democracy. The question is how the citizenry is engaged. And I still fear Nuremberg rallies. I fear mass popular expressions of passion. And I think that the history of the 20th century gives us reason to be cautious about that. The question to my mind is how participation takes place. I tend to be an institutionalist. The way successful democracies have worked is they've channeled citizen participation through political parties so that there is an organized mechanism in which preferences are translated into governance. The crisis for me right now is that has failed. And so there is a challenge, and on this I agree with Roberto, of how to re-engage the citizenry. I tend to be more cautious about plebiscites, about one-shot answers, but so let me just offer that as a little bit of a halfway point. I would much prefer to just separate completely, but let me offer that.
Ruti?
I think you were blacking out when I was giving my sentence. So I took my position on continuing the dialogue, and I think I agree that there's good. Some of the fears Sam raised, but there's good populism. There's bad populism and there's good populism, and we shouldn't be afraid to distinguish them. And I think that that's part of what's happening in the U.S. today, is that we are seeing a discussion going on about what are our shared commitments. Yeah.
Dr. Shan?
Yeah. I think I just want to just connect something that my good friend Oren Yiftachel has actually posed as a question about the other big thing that we have seen during the 90s and 2000s is the rise of a particular kind model of capitalist globalization as well as immigration of a particular kind, which has fed into and fueled the rise of these new majoritarian democracies, as I've called them, and how we should think about that. And I think that it's a very important question. And I didn't have the time to unpack much of what I said today, but the key issue for me is the everyday violations of rights of minorities, not even the spectacular occasional bursts of violence like Gujarat, for example, that I mentioned, but the everyday depredations, everyday violations, and the ability of the rest of the population to tolerate or ignore or be apathetic to those everyday humiliations, violations, and so on. And those violations are very much connected to the way the particular form of capitalist globalization has actually played out. The way people have been, for example, made to feel more and more, to feel like they're living on edge, to make it feel like they have to choose, for example, between paying a rent and choosing food, for example. That's the kind of reality that we are seeing around the world. And that, as we all know, is very much connected to the rise of a particular form of democratic governance in countries around the world based on majoritarian sentiments. And I don't think that majoritarianism alone can be tackled without tackling the question of economics at the bottom of it. Thank you.
Yeah, I certainly agree on that. That was what my paper was supposed to be for this conference, but ran out of time, as happens. Leslie, Roberto.
Yeah, I'll just add one sentence. I guess I would echo the things that were said in the room, because I think, dialogue, economic solutions, and institutions that can effectively channel and engage that broader participatory element. And, when we see the level, unprecedented engagement through social protest, debilitating numbers in terms of racial inequality and generational inequality on COVID's very differential impacts. Dialogue essential, but clearly going to be very far from sufficient. And I guess the final thing I would say is, what do you do about a moment in the US history where young people, younger generations have never really liked the idea. There's been no socialization into accepting that political parties and older structures are the best way to channel their engagement. And now a generation that is a lost generation when it comes to education and employment opportunities and things being shut down at a time when they're actually, for the most part, quite healthy. So I think it's a deeply worrying moment. I'm not sure that I have any answers, but
and socialization as well for a lost generation. Roberto, a quick wrap up from you, and
yes,
we'll take a break.
Yes, I would just say that we shouldn't equate majoritarianism with the government of elites. That's what we have. So what we have is even worse. We have the autonomization, the autonomy of elites. They are totally out of control. So we shouldn't, I would say it's an insult to democracy to say that's a government of the majority. What majority? We have no control at all. So, and then just one line about the dialogue, the conversation among equals. That's, doesn't mean referendum. I wanted to clarify that. Dialogue is not one shot. Dialogue is a process where we say, this is okay, this is not, do this, not do that, do in this way, not that way, this person yes, that person no. So dialogue is something very different. So normally, those traditional forms of popular participation do not honor the principle of a conversation among equals.
Okay, thank you so much for everyone. This was an incredibly rich opening panel, not unexpectedly so. And like I said, we'll also try to make sure that we have a process of interaction with the audience and to collect questions in a way that and with each other as a workshop. We're learning by doing. So I think we'll take the 20-minute break. I'm not going to say what time. It would be 7 p.m. in Israel, so you can trace back from that. And we'll see you then. Natalie, you're the chair, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, right. So we'll see. I'm passing the baton, so to speak. We'll see you then.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you all.
Okay, welcome back, everyone, to our second panel titled Democratic Retrogression and Transitional Justice, A View from the Field. My name is Natalie Davidson. I'm a lecturer at Tel Aviv University, and as others have said before me, I'm very, very sorry and disappointed that we can't actually meet in person, but given the circumstances, this is really great. And I'm also very happy about the long-term collaboration in the past year with Hebrew University Jerusalem, and I look forward to more of these collaborations. So we have three outstanding speakers today, and from the title, which ends with A View from the Field, you might get certain impressions, but actually from the abstracts, these pieces are very, very theoretical, but they combine an engagement, a deep engagement with theory, with illustrations from case studies or a lot of comparative law and politics. So this should be particularly interesting. I'm going to present briefly our three speakers. Then each of them will speak for 15 minutes, after which we'll take questions both from the audience and from the other conference speakers. I'll repeat this at the end of the presentations, but I'll explain this already now. Members of the audience, you should write your questions in the Q&A tool. Okay, this is the tool at the bottom right of your screen. Members of the conference, okay, you're defined in the application, in the Zoom app as panelists, but even if you're not a panelist, a speaker at the conference, you can ask questions by raising your hand through the Zoom app. I'll repeat these explanations later. So our first speaker today is Dr. Jens Iversen, an assistant professor at Leiden University, who before joining academia practiced at the ICTY. He worked at the Coalition for the International Criminal Court, the Hague Appeal for Peace, and the Cambodian Genocide Program. He's published widely on international criminal law, environmental protection, international humanitarian law, the history of international law, transitional justice, and human rights. And his next volume, titled Jus Post Bellum, will be published soon. Our second speaker will be Dr. Maria Verracchi, a lecturer in international law at the War Studies Department at King's College, London. Before King's College, she held research positions with the Eric Castren Institute of International Law in Helsinki, the Law Faculty of Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and immediately before that, she was an assistant professor in international law at Kadir Has University, Faculty of Law in Istanbul. She also has experience in international legal practice, having worked for the OHCHR in Geneva and the legal advisory section of the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court in The Hague, amongst other positions. And since 2017, she's a member of the ILA Committee on Human Rights in Times of Emergency. And her latest publication is the edited volume, Ethical Leadership in International Organizations, Concepts, Narratives, Judgments, and Assessment. And our last speaker, if the two first are quite clearly international lawyer, our third is primarily a constitutional lawyer. Yaniv Roznai is associate professor at the Harry Radziner Law School, IDC Herzliya, and a co-chair of the Israeli section of the International Society of Public Law, ICON. He's the author of the famous Unconstitutional Constitutional Amendments, The Limits of Amendment Powers, published with OUP, and Constitutional Revolutions, recently published with Gary Jacobson. So we'll start with Jens Iversen, whose presentation, False Transitional Justice Used Against Transitions to Democracy, Why Legal Integrity is More Important Than Legal Technology. So I remind each of you, you have 15 minutes. Let's see, let's give Jens a last try. Okay, now he's completely disappeared. So let's start with Maria, okay?
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you very much for being in this wonderful event. It's very sad that I'm not in Israel myself, but I'm very close. I'm still in Greece. So having said that, you know, being Greek, you know, I could associate with the first panel, Ruti, you know, all the Argentinians there. But when we speak about transitional justice, Greece is considered to be, you know, a parallel comparative case study with Argentina. Having said that, of course, being Greek, we always want to appropriate democracy and everything. I can tell you that today and for the next 2 days, we have this, there is this event, the Athens Democracy Forum. And out of curiosity, I checked the theme of this year and I saw that it says, the new abnormal, reimagining democracy. And somehow I felt also that the title of this abstract, I sent you, you know, it's very much, it's half, because I say transitional justice after democracy, comma, and then I say why we shouldn't abandon democracy. And I would add here, how can we reinvent or reimagine democracy? And in order to, just an introductory note, yes, what I'm going to discuss the next 12 minutes, it focuses a lot on a case study, but as Natalie said, it actually triggers some questions. So here I don't have answers, I have more questions. And these are questions that have been created from my personal experience, especially having lived for some time in Turkey and follow the developments in Turkey the last years, especially after 2016. So having said that, I would like to, I'm not going to repeat what the first panel, of course, introduced us about, whether we have a backlash against democracy and against multilateralism. I would say that I will avoid a little bit the word crisis, because every time I use the word crisis, I'm under attack. Or I feel I hit a wall from fellow academics with questions. Do we really have a crisis? Are we really in crisis? Wasn't there always a crisis? What do we mean about crisis? Not to mention also the famous article of Professor Hilary Charlesworth speaking of international law as a discipline of crisis, that we international legal scholars thrive in crisis. We need crisis. So I avoid the word crisis, and being stuck for the last 6 months in Greece, I found in my old library this book, of course, by Norberto Bobbio, The Future of Democracy. And when I was going through the first pages today, I read something very interesting saying that I don't talk of crisis. I prefer to talk of transformation rather than of crisis, because crisis suggests an imminent collapse. So here, you know, although I associate with the word crisis in many respects, I will avoid using the word crisis and speak of transformation, reinvention, reimagination, all the other words that carry a sensibility of hope, of change, and not despair. So having said that, I'm going to bring you back to a bit of despair. I'm very self-contradictory, and I will focus on Turkey. Having said that, I think Turkey is a case study that does not fit the usual, I can be sarcastic, cool, critical perspective of a country, you know, that liberal democracy was supposed to be applied, and then look what happened. Unfortunately, here I will associate with Samuel speaking about the nightmare of democracy. And I don't know if Roberto is still, yes, he's still with us, you know. I'm very keen to discuss about what happens in situations when you cannot have a conversation at all, not only a conversation among equals. So Turkey is an unfortunately case study. Of course, Turkey is what Ruti described, where you had a parallel, I would say, now we see a parallel decline of democratic process and transitional justice, but one should question whether to any extent there was a proper, I mean, not a proper, but a normal, an actual democratic development in Turkey and a parallel democratic development in transitional justice. However, one could say that at the beginning of the millennium, this idea of entering the European Union triggered some initiatives for Turkey, and there were some developments. Like it's not a theory, it's not theory what I'm talking, but having discussed with people who were based there and who participated in transitional justice mechanism, there was a feeling of hope, you know, that something could change. For once, you know, the Kurdish language was not illegal. You could have some shows on TV that they were also in Kurdish language. So there was some progress, some parallel progress between democratic developments, democratic consolidation, and some transitional developments. Again, some progress. I'm not presenting a rosy picture here, because Turkey historically, politically, was a problematic, it is a problematic country when it comes to democracy. But things changed, and things changed radically. Of course, there were signs before, but after 2015, particularly the elections in June 2015, and within one day, everything came upside down. So people who participated in transitional justice institutes and think tanks and discussions, conversations, like Roberto said before, immediately, you know, they were characterized as people who assisted or collaborated with terrorists. And not only that, a year later, that includes also many academics, many friends of mine, colleagues of mine who signed the famous Declaration for Peace, and they were fired by some institutions, so they were sent into prison. But a year later, after the attempted failed coup d'etat, several of these people, initially, you could see that the target, you know, the oppression was targeting particular groups such as journalists, academics, writers, intellectuals, people who participated, you know, among others, in civil society organizations. So Turkey is a classic, I would say, example. Somehow it's a mainstream example. I hate the word mainstream, I can say that, but it is a mainstream example where you see a parallel erosion of the rule of law, where there's no freedom of expression, not to mention academic freedom of expression, and a suppression, a shutdown of the civil society, a civil society that was thriving until a couple of years ago, and they believed that they could thrive, and they developed projects when it comes to transitional justice. On the other hand, parallel, you know, with that, we can see again, I'm terrified to address the issue of Turkey with esteemed scholars on democracy, whether I can even say whether Turkey is a case of liberal democracy or failed democracy or what it is. I don't know. I think that it is the nightmare of democracy. I agree with that, especially when you have the tyranny of the majority over there. But you could see, you know, that elements of nationalism and populism, to what extent contributed into the revisionist language, you know, of the past and the present. So it's not only the southeastern Turkey and the Kurdish issue or the Armenian issue, which is very much It was the issue that had obtained some field during the, if we can say, the good years of democratic development in Turkey, but it's also a general trend of revisionism towards everything and every neighbor. Having said that, using this example, I admit that I felt quite despair myself, because every time if I gave this talk 10 years ago, I would be more critical about democracy or transitional justice or liberal democracy. But now I feel that I oscillate between what I call critique of the bad of sides of the dark sides of democracy and transitional justice, and faith in the bright sides of democracy and transitional justice. And based on what we discussed in the first panel, it's a question that I struggle with as a scholar, as someone who teaching transitional justice, but also international law. How do we deal, how do we balance between our critique and our faith? How can we reinvent a kind of democratic sensibility, maybe a moderate democratic sensibility? How can we go back to moderates such as Norberto Bobbio or Judith Sklar and bring back the liberalism of fear? How can we revive democracy, not only against regimes, that we can call them the tyranny of the majority, but also how can we revive the interest of citizens towards democracy without being cynical? And first of all, how can we avoid being cynical when we experience all the things we experience? I have to say that if I didn't live in Turkey for some time, being a girl, a Greek woman, after the fall of the junta in Greece, who always experienced a kind of democracy, okay, not the perfect democracy, but a European democracy, I wouldn't think and I wouldn't appreciate the importance of some basic elements of democracy that I have been living for. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria. We now turn to Dr. Jens Iversen. I apologize for the previous technical problems. The floor is yours. I'll repeat the title of your presentation.
Wait, let me interrupt. I'm going to change the title of my presentation. So
the floor is yours.
Okay, fantastic. I'm assuming everyone can hear and see me. I really want to thank the organizers, Danny Everin, Rachel Klagsburn, Leo Bilski, Tomer Broda. Thanks, Natalie Davidson, for chairing, and really everyone at the Minerva Center and Hebrew University who made the conference possible. It's really a pleasure to listen in and to be invited to speak briefly. So my new working title has changed slightly. I now think of it as Democracy's Ambition for Itself, Why Legal Integrity is More Important Than Legal Technology. I'm very much arguing against the idea that's been introduced so far that there's a backlash against transitional justice at the root of our current crisis. I'm arguing that we were not too bold, but too timid, and that we're timid because we haven't taken democratic integrity seriously enough. So the question I'd like to start with is, what would it look like if democracies took democratic transitions and democratic consolidation really seriously? Or to put it another way, what would the world be like today if, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, consolidated democracies had put democratic integrity at the center of their international relations and domestic ambitions? Obviously, leading questions with a lot of assumptions, but I don't mean them rhetorically. So let me tell you what my answers to those questions are, and then perhaps in the Q&A I can learn from others' thoughts on the matter. So here's my central assertion. If democracies had taken democratic transition and consolidation seriously over the last 30 years, if they had embraced democracy's ambition for itself, they would have done at least three things. First, we should have, but failed to, make a sustained, well-funded effort to ensure that the economic rights and security of people in fragile transitional democracies were protected. Second, we should have provided robust support for the rule of law in emerging democracies, particularly the integrity of the judiciary and regulation of financial markets and corporate governance. And third, we should have taken the opportunity, the reduction in external threat, to reinvigorate our own democracies, reinforcing the integrity of those democracies with a reaffirmation of our commitment to core liberal values. And we didn't do those things. And that's a large part of the story of why I do think we face a crisis of democracy today. And I think the reason we didn't seriously attempt these ambitious projects was essentially hubris, right? There's a sense of inevitability, triumphalism, faith that what was needed in the 90s was a spread of legal technology that once invented would not easily be forgotten, rather than legal integrity, which requires constant vigilance and effort. There was a sense we could simply invent and export legal tools, and the tools would essentially do the work for us without real sacrifice or oversight or introspection. So these tools include political legal tools such as elections, economic law tools such as protection for investors and exporters, transitional justice tools such as truth commissions, ICL prosecutions, vetting. And I don't have anything against these tools in the abstract, nothing against what I'm calling legal technology, except that they can blind us to the importance of actual commitment to democratic legal integrity. And without that commitment to democracy, these tools can and have been easily abused and in fact turned against democratic transition and democracy. So with that framing, let's go back to an old argument, an argument about legal integrity. So this is an argument between Ronald Dworkin and Robert Bork. So before Dworkin publishes Law's Empire in '86, he gives a lecture in 1984. That lecture, Law's Ambitions for Itself, was about legal integrity, using a set of metaphors, particularly this titular metaphor, that law has its own ambitions. And I'm stealing that metaphor for my argument today to make the argument democracy should have its own unabashed ambitions internally and externally. So Dworkin's central idea is really internal, that so-called judge-made law is at its best not illegitimate, but rather this discovery of an underlying identity and integrity in the law, which describes the existing law more accurately than it might have been understood before the judge-made law is issued. And this idea works if you believe the legal system is designed to have integrity, which binds it together, that it's meaningful to reveal the law in its best light, and that that integrity is really central to its operation as law rather than just power. And I think it's helpful to know what Dworkin was for, his meaning of integrity, to also look at what he's against. So the so-called conservative legal movement in the US, now reaching a crescendo these years later, was embodied in at the time in the form of Judge Bork. And Bork and others, I would argue, are reacting to this deepening of democracy in the US during the civil rights movement in the Warren Court, and they seize on a professed adherence to text to reject this forward march. And his denial of rights to homosexuals in Dronenberg v. Zeck is a good example of this, right? And the fact that these rights were previously extended to married couples in Eisenstadt, or interracial couples in Loving, or women in Roe is no matter. Bork strikes the pose of just, an apolitical text reader, right? Since there's no text in the Constitution that directly, unambiguously constrains the government from discriminating against Dronenberg for his sexual orientation, Bork rules against Dronenberg. Now, the best argument against Bork's interpretive approach is the argument that law should be applied consistently and with integrity, right? That one shouldn't just ignore the forest when analyzing the tree, that in a democracy, this means revealing the law in the best possible light in view of the political morality inherent to and integral to democracy. And the dedication to that underlying political morality rooted in the Enlightenment isn't naive or needlessly political. It's necessary to reveal the law. So that's Dworkin's argument with Bork. Should democratic legal integrity guide legal interpretation or not? I'm extending this idea of legal integrity here to how consolidated democracies can relate to transitional democracies, that it's meaningful to talk about foreign relations and democratic integrity, to argue there's something fundamentally broken about a democracy that doesn't realize its own ambition and then pursue it with integrity, both at home and abroad. So to amplify, what does this have to do with transitional justice and the crisis of democracy? So I'll take those in turn, first saying how I think legal integrity relates to transitional justice, and then democracy, and how they relate to each other, and how the lack of integrity currently threatens us all. So first, I'm arguing that the turn in transitional justice, which I think Rudy has already highlighted, from a normative pro-democratic movement for democratic transition to a more neutral, apolitical legal technology is in fact a failure of integrity, right? So between Rudy Teitel's initial laudable emphasis on transition in the context of political change towards democracy to this more apolitical toolkit that was pushed in the United Nations and some other places, we've lost something really vital. While the desire to expand early transitional justice efforts to a broad application of transitional justice tools without the emphasis on democracy, it's not malign in intent, but it's really just sapping the project of focus and vigor and making it a shell, right? So if the term transitional justice is applied to any use of these legal technologies, regardless of whether it furthers the political morality that originally informed transitional justice projects, I think that's a failure of integrity. Now, I think there's a return to integrity in what's often now being called transformational justice, at least in, academic emphasis. And I think that's long overdue. But to fulfill this original promise of transitional justice, I think the emphasis on democracy has to be remembered and reinforced. Now, if transitional justice had been fully backed and financed by consolidated democracies in the same way we finance national and regional security, instead of leaving these efforts to be done mostly inexpensively and in sort of a piecemeal fashion, I'd argue that the original focus on achieving a robust democracy after human rights violating regimes are overthrown would have been maintained and really expanded. We could have expanded our vision of transitional justice to include distributive justice, a demand made by Ramamani as far back as 2002, right? So now I'll turn to how I think my theme relates to the current crisis of democracy. So second, let's think about transitions to democracy that worked for a moment. Let's think back to happier days, right? So the invisible sort of non-crises we might forget about. We can think back to Western Germany, South Korea, Japan after World War II, where they're transforming these regimes from totalitarian regimes to democracy, in large part because victorious democracies took democracy seriously. So this isn't how the issue is normally framed, but it's nonetheless true on the whole. Fear of the Soviet Union drives this push towards democratic transformation, but it's really important to note the transformation isn't inevitable. It was a choice that's made from the US side, led by President Truman, based on the recognition that a commitment towards democracy is both moral and in the enlightened self-interest of occupying states. So it takes sacrifice and oversight, and in certain cases, such as Truman's integration of the armed forces, it takes introspection and an enormous amount of money and sustained policy. But it works. But at key moments, other governments haven't made the same choice, right? Eisenhower's administration turns away from the demands of democratic integrity, undermines, overthrows emerging democracies in Guatemala and Iran. Support of authoritarian regime continues under subsequent US administrations. And while I acknowledge the efforts of many in Israel to foster democracy, more generally, Israel occupies the West Bank and the Gaza Strip for more than 50 years, and there's no comparable effort for democratic transformation comparable to the effort after World War II. So I would argue these choices all lack integrity. They betray democracy's ambition towards itself, and the results are often horrific. Now, after the Cold War, the states of Eastern Europe, especially Russia, they're subjected to a savage and unnecessary depression during the aftermath of the Soviet collapse. And this was seen as natural, right? What we saw was the export of legal technology, not a real investment in democracy. We saw the export of legal technology of multi-party democracy, but without the commitment to the norms of democracy. We have a system of economic regulation that sort of mimics Western corporate governance, but without any sense of integrity or fiduciary duty. And these are seen, hubristically as part of just this inevitable march of democracy, progress, end of history. But what they really are failures of integrity. You can imagine if, out of a sense of integrity, solidarity, compassion, advanced democracies had displayed the same sort of sacrifice and commitment that they displayed in the 1940s, in the 1990s and 2000, right? Imagine if Juan Linz had really been listened to when he identified problems in his 96 work, Problems of Democratic Transition and Consolidation. Imagine if Russia were as firmly democratic today as Western Germany was by the 1970s. Would we be facing the same sort of crisis today at all? What if a robust democracy had managed to take hold in Palestine? Imagine if there had been a strategy to welcome fledgling democracy that was enthusiastically financed, that a welcome package had made the Arab Spring more of a success, or if the effort to build democracy in Afghanistan had been approached with integrity and not diverted. I think it's important to just acknowledge we failed to win a democratic peace after the Cold War. We have failed in democratic ambition, and this wasn't inevitable. It was, in part, a choice, even if we didn't recognize it at the time. And I just want to end with a note, there's nothing preventing legal tools wrapped in the aura of transitional justice from being used against us, right? If the system we've built lacks democratic legal integrity, nothing stopped Idi Amin from rolling out his own Truth Commission. Nothing stopped international criminal prosecutions from reinforcing illiberal regimes in Rwanda, Cambodia, or Uganda. So if Israel wishes to have a Truth Commission, as Dr. Braca ambitiously proposes, it could have fantastic results, or it could make matters worse, depending on whether it was backed by genuine commitment to democratic integrity. It can't be cheaply done or done without sacrifice. In the US, a Truth Commission that lacks democratic integrity might persecute those the president labels enemies of the people in the deep state. So legal technology won't save us, but democratic legal integrity may. So my hope with Dworkin is for a future where democracies that admit and celebrate their own democratic ambitions and reveal themselves in a better light.
Thank you very much. I have to say it's really striking, and I think it probably reflects something about what's going on in this field, well, in the field of transitional justice, and also more generally among lawyers. If we started with Maria's expression of really of self-searching and reflection, she said, how do we balance between our critique and our faith? Which I think some of us could relate to. Here we really have, I think, a pretty strong affirmation of faith in a certain set of values, and I look forward to talking about it more in the Q&A. And now we're moving on to Yaniv Roznai, whose official title, I don't know if he's changed the title, is Transitional Justice Forever, ?
Thank you very much, Natalie. I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you very much for organizing this great event. I'm very much happy and honored to be here. So this is a paper I started writing just for this conference, so I'll be more than delighted to get some comments. But before I start with my presentation, I have to share with you something. About a week ago, the Colombian Constitutional Court rendered an important decision about the right to protest. And there is one paragraph which I find extremely relevant to our conference. A nation that seeks to recover and build its democratic identity cannot locate the scenery that legitimately protests in the rhetoric of friend and foe, left and right, good and bad, friends of peace and enemies of the peace, but as the political expression that seeks open space for dialogue, consensus, and the nonviolent reconstruction of the constitutional state of law. So for me, this is the crucial point of this conference. Transitional justice talks about compromise, about unity, and in the current wave of populism, when we have this distinction between enemy and friends, this is, I think, the main challenge that we have for transitional justice. When the other side is being delegitimized, that's the biggest problem. But we can talk about it later. That's not the topic of my paper. So basically, the paper tries to connect two fields: constitutional unamendability and transitional justice. What I mean by constitutional unamendability is that certain constitutional values, rules, or institutions are considered as unamendable. They are untouchable. They cannot be amended by the formal amendment procedure. Like the candles of Hanukkah, you can only watch them, you cannot touch them. Now, the two topics are related because various constitutions, such as Fiji, Nigeria, Burundi, Sudan, protect as unamendable constitutional provisions concerning amnesties, reconciliation, and peace agreements. Now, while there is quite a significant amount of literature on unamendability, there's hardly any literature on this issue, with perhaps one recent exception. This is Sylvia Soutou's paper in Global Constitutionalism from 2 years ago. So I want to talk about two aspects of unamendability and transitional justice. The first one is unamendability as facilitating transitional justice. One mechanism involving transitional justice is granting amnesties, releasing certain groups and their leaders from responsibility for past actions. We know that. We've seen it in South Africa and elsewhere. But then amnesties have been elevated to unamendability in constitutions such as Nigeria in 2010, or take, for example, the Fijian constitution of 2012. It stipulates the following. It includes an extended provision on immunities and amnesties conducted during the 2006 coup d'etat, and it declares the following. This chapter and any immunity granted or continued in this chapter shall not be reviewed, amended, altered, repealed, or revoked. So it's not only that it is unamendable, but it is also not subject to judicial review. Now, this might be a backlash against the court decision declaring the 2006 coup as illegal. So now the new constitution legitimates the regime and also limits the ability of judicial power in that respect. Now, why do we want to protect amnesties through unamendability? I think that the intention behind unamendability is clear. It provides guarantees to those formerly fighting parties that they will not face prosecution once the new constitution comes into force. And therefore it ensures that they join the broader political settlement. Now, Richard Albert called this reconciliatory eternity. Now, such unamendable protection of amnesties, I think it makes these amnesties a more credible commitment to the losing side. So if, for example, continued conflict is still a serious threat, an autocrat elite might be afraid that the majority's promise of an amnesty is revoked once they step down from power. So the incumbent government might prefer a violent conflict as opposed to stepping down and facing prosecution despite the promise of an amnesty. Now, in this situation, making the promise as an unamendable provision increases the promise's credibility. It serves to indicate the commitment of the drafters to maintaining amnesties beyond the ratification of the new constitution. Now, such pledges are especially important to minority or weaker parties who may otherwise fear that the majority would amend the amnesties once the constitution is ratified. Now, unamendability in this scenario may be problematic, of course, to the victims of the crimes who may not be represented by either groups. And it also suffers from legitimacy problems, which goes back to the peace versus justice debates and controversies over the rise of individual criminal responsibility in international. Now, political agreement between rival parties is both hard-fought and fragile. Now, as such, the promise of unamendability is taken as a guarantee of the terms of the agreement, both before and after the adoption of the new constitution. Unamendability here plays a primary role as guarantor of the post-constitutional political settlement. It is a tool for facilitating and later safeguarding the political settlement. It promises transitional justice forever. There are two challenges. One, unamendability aims to safeguard the political settlement by forever blocking certain avenues for change, but this is in the short term. It severely aggregates the problem if we want a future, if we want to change the constitution in the future. Let's assume, for example, the elite would need to change the constitution in a way that would provide for more normative commitments to constitutionalism, but is then blocked. What do we do? The second problem is that unamendability tends to result in the empowerment of the court. Because once we have unamendability in the constitution, then the court implicitly possesses the power to review the amendments on substantive grounds. Now, not always these bodies are equipped to do this kind of judicial review. So I think that this mechanism now brings the counter-majoritarian difficulty to its peak. These are two main challenges. And I think that these challenges are exacerbated when one considers the context that Jenna Sapiano describes in her piece in Global Constitutionalism on Peace Agreements. She says the following: peace agreement constitutions are typically elite broker pacts, often negotiated and signed at the exclusion of broader participation. A compromise constitution cannot be understood as an endpoint if it is to function in a deeply divided state emerging from high-level conflict. Now, it is one thing to have a constitution drafted without the involvement of the people. It is another thing to ensure that this constitutional document is unchangeable and that this unchangeability is enforced through courts. This, I think, brings the constitutional imposition to its highest degree. Now, there are two possible alternatives to relax these challenges. One is interim constitutions. An interim constitution can contain unamendable commitments. This was the case, if you remember, in South Africa with the famous 34 unamendable principles. And an interim constitution may have the advantages of securing consensus around certain non-negotiable principles without the risk of eternal entrenchment. The other alternative is sunset clauses. One of the most famous examples of sunset clauses was the incorporation in the US Constitution of the protection of slave trade that was protected from changes until 1808. Now, the advantage is that this prioritizes stability over flexibility, but not forever. So sunset clauses achieve many of the virtues of unamendability without the drawbacks of long-term rigidity. So they may facilitate and safeguard the initial agreement without frustrating constitutional evolution at a later stage. However, to the extent that unamendability is aimed precisely to preclude any renegotiation of principles, both mechanisms are insufficient. So this is the first aspect, unamendability as facilitating transitional justice. But now I want to talk about unamendability as blocking transitional justice. Unamendability also functions as a mechanism that blocks transitional justice. Imagine the challenge transitional justice architects face when they attempt to create a transitional justice mechanism within an already existing constitution. And what if certain provisions are regarded as unamendable, either explicitly or implicitly? Transitional justice within the framework of an existing unamendable constitution presents a dilemma which Carlos Bernal Pulido calls the transitional dilemma. Either the transition is successful, but the constitution is no longer permanent anymore, or the constitution maintains its permanent character, but then this renders the transition impossible. Now, this dilemma is raised when there is a decision to get the transition by means of constitutional amendment rather than through a replacement or an interim constitution, which this implies an intention not to break the existing constitution too radically. Now, this dilemma is important because many peace agreements take place within the framework of existing constitutions and contain provisions concerning constitutional reforms. In a forthcoming piece at ICON, Tariq Olsa et al. Collected peace agreements, and they show that more than 100 peace agreements concluded since 1989 contain provisions on constitutional reform. But this, of course, then exposes the peace process to constitutional challenges. And I want to focus on one example in the last few minutes I have, and this is Colombia. So as you know, the Colombian government is carrying out peace negotiations with the guerrilla groups, right, with the Armed Revolutionary Force of Colombia, the FARC, and this process was being brought within the framework of the 1991 Colombian Constitution. This is not a transitional constitution, a permanent one. Now in 2012, the Colombian Constitution was amended to make provision for peace negotiation with the FARC, creating a number of exceptional transitional justice mechanisms, such as granting powers to Congress to create privileges for members of the FARC and giving immunities to perpetrators of crimes, etc. Now, prima facie, these mechanisms appear to be at odds with essential principles of the Constitution, such as equality or the rule of law. Now, this raises difficulties as the Colombian Constitutional Court has established a specific doctrine called constitutional replacement doctrine, according to which constitutional amendments inconsistent with the essential principles of the Constitution are invalid. So according to the court in Colombia, the power to amend the Constitution does not include the power to replace the Constitution with a new one or destroy its essential elements or basic structure. Now, in various judgments from 2013, 2014, 2016, the court examined various aspects of these amendments and allowed them. The court held that these are not constitutional replacement. However, in later cases, beginning from middle of 2017, it held that certain aspects of various constitutional amendments concerning the peace process substantially altered the decision-making powers of Congress, and that these changes to the guarantees of separation of powers amounted to substitution of the Constitution. It continued to review aspects of the peace process. So in late 2017, it upheld most of the temporary amendments that created a special peace jurisdiction. So it reviewed it, and it struck down parts of the amendment. For example, the parts of the amendment that limited the review of the court over the special jurisdiction, and those that restricted the normal powers of the Inspector General. So what we have here, we have an example of a court blocking or hindering a peace process, a transitional justice process. And I have other examples from the Philippines as well. Now, the reason I'm raising this, and here I'm concluding, is that in light of the global spread of the doctrine of unconstitutional amendments, it is likely that constitutional courts around the world would be drawn into controversies of this sort in the course of transitional justice processes carried out under the framework of existing constitutions. Now, just imagine the judicialization of politics in such context and the possible political backlash to such decisions. So, just to conclude, unamendability has a complex relationship with transitional justice. It can be a mechanism for its facilitation, but it may also be blocking or hindering a mechanism. In either way, it empowers the courts in this process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yaniv. I'd like to give the panelists a first round, just if you have any comments on what your co-panelists said. Maria, you want to start? If you have.
Hi again. Yes, actually, Natalie, I found very to the point your comment, after Jen's talk, like the difference between my personal, as we say, self-challenge, and this confession that I always challenge myself, and I have my critical component, but then I see I'm still looking for, as I say, the innocence in democracy, and how I can respond to other colleagues who are more critical about that, and then the more positive and faithful aspect on that. I don't think I would like to give the floor to the other panelists, and then for more Q&As, if there are other comments, just to discuss more. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Jens, would you like to comment?
There we go. I also really liked both presentations. I guess my question is mostly in terms of, from the perspective of someone who focuses in terms of constitutional law, does international criminal law have any real impact on the ground from what you've seen? Because from, the international criminal law side of things, we take ourselves very seriously and we think we've had this huge impact, right? We think, well, even if you give an amnesty domestically, other states could take jurisdiction through universal jurisdiction, international courts continue to, stick their nose in Colombia and elsewhere. But maybe on the ground, all of this doesn't actually matter at all. So I'm curious for whether there is an impact there or not.
Okay, I assume this is a question for Yaniv.
Yeah, it's for Yaniv. Yeah.
And Yaniv, you can answer, and if you had any comment to the other presentations as well.
Thank Thank you very much. I also prefer to hear the audience. I just want to have one comment to Jens about the economic and financial rights. I think that's a great point, because if you look at what happened in Hungary, so we had this first Cultural Revolution, end of 1980s, early 1990s, right? And now we have this counter-revolution turned to illiberal democracy. And one of the reasons, I think, is that because the Hungarians, in the end of the 1980s, they wanted to be Austria. They looked at Austria, that's what they wanted to be. And when this promise did not fulfill itself, then this somehow was one of the main reasons, I think, for this backlash. Now, about the question, I can talk a lot. I'll just try to be brief. I think that, so generally, the relationship between domestic constitutions and international is quite a complex one. I think that it is a matter of perspective. When we look at the perspective of international tribunals, then obviously international law, either criminal law or others, has this supremacy or prevails over domestic constitutional, right? This, we know this for sure. But then the problem is when we go into domestic juridical sphere, usually the domestic constitution prevail. And when there are any conflicts, usually the court then is torn to decide between the constitution or international obligations. Usually the court then decides according to the domestic constitution. We have some exceptions, I think, for example, in Austria or Switzerland or the Netherlands that give core international obligations priority even over constitutional law, but I think this is rather the exception than the rule. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Leora.
Thank you. Thank you for the panelists and for Natalie. My question goes to Jens. I found your talk really interesting, but I wanted to push you a little bit about it because you seem to say that I agree with you with the idea that there was not enough commitment to democracy, but I want to challenge your idea of integrity in the sense that as if we have one idea of transitioning to democracy, and either we are seriously taking it or we are, going about not taking it seriously enough. But from what I look at, especially if we compare what we had in the 1990s to the post-World War II, maybe we had different understanding, these different assumptions on how to transition into a stable democracy. And especially what is the role of the rule of law in transitioning to democracy as opposed to the rule of the economy or to the rule of redistribution or whatever. And if we think that there are different assumptions about how to reach a stable democracy, then it's not just a matter of integrity, it's the matter of maybe the transitional justice field taking the rule of law so central to achieving democracy have to question itself. Maybe this can explain how we see now the transitioning from democracy with the rule of law, that the rule of law is not the saving us from democracy. So I think here, so I think you should first look differently at different transitions about the assumptions. And also, I think there is a tension between politics and law there. And it seems that at first I heard you talking about legal tools as opposed to political engagement. But then you mix the two, especially by going to Dworkin and saying integrity of law and integrity of politics. So I got lost because maybe there is a tension between the two ways. So just this thought.
Should I respond to that or additional questions or?
Yes, please, you can respond.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that intervention. I think that's really helpful. I think if I had more time and what I've written elsewhere, one of the authors I would go to sort of balance this question of how does democracy polity define itself, prioritize itself, I tend to go to Amartya Sen and then some of the people that he draws upon. And I think it's entirely legitimate to emphasize local ownership and different routes to democracy, and you know, be careful of sort of exporting one version of democracy and being sure that's the right version. At the same time, you know, if you look what actually happened in Eastern Europe and, you know, the former Soviet Union, there very much was an export of a particular, you know, approach to economic governance, which caused a great deal of suffering and backlash. We've already sort of had a discussion with that. In some ways, you know, you can't get around the choice in foreign policy of what kind of democracy you're pushing, although you can try to leave some local flexibility. But the main problem is that I think, you know, established democracies didn't really have their heart in it. They didn't take it very seriously. You know, it would have taken a lot of money to go out there and do anything like what, you know, the Open Society Institute, you know, did. But imagine Open Society Institute times 100, right? Established democracies could have done that. They could have done that with education, as Rudy Teitel has emphasized, but they could have done that in a number of ways as sort of a welcome basket that then could be determined more locally. But we don't do that. We haven't done that. We don't really have that much of a welcoming hand compared to the kind of money we spend in security arrangements.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to remind conference speakers that if you wish to ask a question, you can raise your hand in the participant list. And I'd like to remind members of the audience that you're welcome to ask questions in the Q&A tool at the bottom right side of your screen. In the meantime, we have a question from Tomer Brudi.
Yeah, sorry for giving you the finger on the screen. I have a kind of, I think this might be sort of questioning assumptions, definitely for Jens and also for Yaniv and Maria. When you use the term an established democracy, then what do you actually mean? And what is an established democracy? How far back do we go? Ancient Greece, Maria? Which republic in France is the United States an established democracy? You know, there's sort of some kind of ideal type, a constitutional ideal type that relates both to the crisis of democracy and transition, because, you know, transitioning to what? Yes, we have some kind of ideal type of what a democracy is. So we know what it isn't, right? I mean, and we know what, you know, if you have oppression, military rule, there are lots of things that we know what are not an established democracy. But what actually is your idea of an established democracy? And I've heard quite a lot about that, and I think that's one sort of general thought that is of course troubling, and we might all have different ideas in mind. To Jens, I have a more particular question, because you've talked a lot about money and financing, sort of as a kind of undertone, or and then I wonder, you know, what is the difference between post World War II Japan and post Cold War Hungary in terms of the financial support that they received? And is it correct or useful to sort of focus on that point? It's not a point; it's a huge issue, of course. But I'm not sure that is the sort of at the explanatory level something to focus on. And I'll stop there. I have lots of other questions, but I wanted to float those.
Okay, thank you. So since each of the panelists was asked a question, I think we'll go in turn again, and we'll start with Maria.
Okay, hi. Thank you, Tomer. Well, it's very true that I don't have an answer, but I know what it isn't. So when you said we know what it is not, I can tell you what it is not. So again, I make a personal confession here. I never thought, I always thought that the Greek democracy is problematic. I'm talking about the modern Greek democracy. I'm not talking about the ancient democracy, although again, we, the Greeks, it's one of the very few things we think that we are proud of. But I experience what it is not. when you cannot speak freely, when you cannot post things on social media, when you are always afraid, it goes back for me to what to Judith Sklar and this idea of the liberalism of fear. So that challenged me, and that triggered my understanding of democracy with the basic understandings of separation of powers, of an independent judiciary, that you can trust the judiciary, that it's not it's something there, so this is my answer. But to be honest, I personally go for a more modest understanding of democracy, and I'm going back and I reread again, as I say, I go back to Norberto Bobbio, and I think maybe one of the problems was this overexpansion of our understanding of democracy that actually ended up into this abuse of democracy, maybe a more modest understanding of democracy. I'm not talking only about elections, but a more modest / moderate understanding of democracy. Maybe it could help us, reopen the discussion and try to understand what happened during this way. So that's it.
Thank you. Jens, would you like to answer the questions that were asked of you? And in addition, we have a question from Francisco Lobo, a question for you specifically. Are there any practical constraints for the concept of integrity as applied to democracy? Some transitional justice practitioners used to draw on Weber's distinction between the ethics of conviction and the ethics of responsibility, in the sense that sometimes real-world conditions do not allow for a clear-cut solution based solely on normative principles. So that's an additional question for you, Jens, from Francisco Lobo.
Okay, well, thank you for both of those interventions. I'll try to cover them all briefly. As for what do I mean by like an established democracy, what I meant by it is really to distinguish between an emerging or fragile democracy and those other democracies. I think if I was pressed, what I'd probably go to is, one of the political science indexes, either a variety of them, Freedom House, Polity 4, I'd probably go with Polity 4. So a variety of metrics where you would measure democracy and, recognizing that none of them are perfect, but some of them have ranked high on the index for a while, for what that's worth. As for money, I think, again, the way to think of it is in terms of capacity. You imagine the exhausted democracies after World War II. Now it seems inevitable that there was this huge transformative effort in the states I listed, but it didn't have to be that way. They could have said, oh gosh, this is a lot of effort, we're out, deal with yourself. But they didn't do that. Whereas in the 90s, there were a lot of democracies that had a capacity to do quite a bit more, so I wouldn't measure it on a dollar for dollar basis. I would say how much sacrifice was asked for and how little was actually given. And then on the Weberian, that's excellent. I'm going to have to copy and paste it and look at it. I'm hoping it's there in the chat, but I think obviously there's the critique that this is naive, that you have to deal, you have to support authoritarian regimes, the world isn't as you would like it. And, when I talk about this as, sort of a duty towards integrity, there are limits to that. You just can't remake the world. At the same time, I think whatever the bar is, we've been way, way below it, that it's obvious that more could have been done safely, but just wasn't.
Okay, thank you, Yaniv.
Thank you very much. So I assume I need to talk about the question on established democracies as well. I think it's a tough one, I guess. Well, first about democracy, I don't think there's some binary answer, and I think it's more of a spectrum. So a country can be a more liberal democracy towards less liberal democracy, and perhaps at a certain point, we will say that it is no longer a democracy, but it's more of a spectrum. What I do not accept those leaders claim that, like Orban, that they are now leading an illiberal democracy. I think that every democracy must be liberal to some extent. You cannot have a democracy that it's illiberal, to my mind, even if we just focus on merely electoral democracy. Just the elections themselves necessitate liberalism and protection of certain rights and principles, etc. That's one thing. And about the established, I think that's, again, a tough one. I would assume, since the median lifetime of world constitution is 19 years. So half of the world, half of the countries in the world replace their constitutions after 19 years. So I guess if democracy manages to endure various cycles of this median lifespan, then we can say that that's an established democracy. But of course, it's open for debate. I want to raise, Natalie, if I have another minute, just 2 points to broaden maybe the discussion. I raised at the beginning the point of enemy and friend, and how this is a significant feature in the battle against maybe transitional justice. I want to raise two more points. One of them, when we talk about transitional justice, we face the community and the polity to look boldly at the past, right? To come clean about the past, to confront the past and come clean. What we see now in the populist countries, we see the complete opposite. We are deleting the past. We use memory laws to change the past. Why do we need to face the past, right? And say that we did something wrong if we can simply control how the past is conceived with the people in future generations. That's one, I think, that's one main challenge. We've seen the memory laws in Poland and elsewhere. The second problem that I find is the distinction between, or the conflict between simplicity and complexity. Transitional justice processes are complex processes. There are many issues on the table. You need to compromise between them. And this goes against the agenda of the populist leaders to have simple answers for anything. Yes or no. Brexit, yes or no. We build a wall, yes or no. But transitional justice are much more complex than this. So I think these are two elements that put this thing under challenge.
Okay, thank you very much. Maria would like to add something.
I think it's very much related to what Yaniv just said, and it's very much related also to the question by Francisco before, the Weberian question. And I agree that we talk about institutions, we talk about abstract ideas, but at the end of the day, you know, institutions are set up, are organized, are conceived, you know, by human agents, by human beings, you know, and the idea of human agency and the idea of responsibility, and that goes back, you know, to we don't have one solution for everything. This is very cliche. Like I don't even want to talk about the basic, but the importance, you know, of human of the leadership of the political leader or of the legal leader, I would say, you know, at that time is paramount. And when this is where it goes back, you know, to responsibility, goes back to exercise of discretion, it goes back to our judgment. And those are issues, you know, that usually we do not pay attention because we focus a lot into the institutions, into the what we have, the state, but we are talking about at the end of the day, you know, human individuals who make decisions and exercise their discretion. So that goes back all, you know, to democracy and transitional justice and more concrete ideas. And I think if we concretize a little bit all these abstract notions, then maybe, you know, we can think about also our own responsibility, going back to what Roberto was talking at the previous panel. So thank you.
Thank you. Before I ask my own question, is there anyone else here among the conference speakers or in the audience who'd like to take the opportunity and comment or ask something? Okay, so I'd like to go back to the issue of the relationship between liberalism and democracy. This is what Yaniv ended with. You said you believe we cannot have democracy without liberalism. In Jens's presentation, his third point was that if we took democracy and democratic consolidation seriously, then we would have a stronger reaffirmation of core liberal values. And I wanted to ask Maria if you have, what your thoughts are on liberalism. You said you were torn between your critique and your faith. Does your critique have anything to do with certain problems of liberalism? And I'd also like to draw Roberto Gargarella into this. Is your notion, how do you see the relationship between liberalism and democracy? And is your idea of a democracy that is more of a conversation among equals, can that be grounded? Is that grounded in liberal values, or is it grounded in some kind of other ideology, something else? So Maria first, and then turning back to Roberto.
Natalie, you asked the $1 million question, about liberalism. It's very difficult. I'm very, very honest about that. And what I'm saying is, I think that there is a distortion of the concept of liberalism, because if we ask, I don't know how many participants are now, in this session, each of us has a different understanding of liberalism. And I was telling to a friend the other day how the death of RGB, the notorious RGB, somehow exonerated the notion of liberalism, because, we felt that we didn't have this guilt, to say we are liberals. Personally, I'm still very much confused. If someone asks to pigeonhole me as an international lawyer, most likely, I belong to the mainstream. Oh, she's a liberal, whatever that means. If you ask me, I find very problematic components of the application of liberalism, the way it was applied. But yes, I believe in basic concepts of liberalism. I think it's very important to differentiate between liberalism and neoliberalism. I think there is a confusion among scholars, and that's why I reread Judith Sklar, and there are some new books, about her liberalism nowadays. So I'm reading this new edited volume about the skeptical radicalism of Judith Sklar, which goes back to her liberalism and what her liberalism means today. So for me, maybe one point is this narrow idea of liberalism, this liberalism of fear, to go back to that and then start moving from there. But definitely in the name of liberalism, we have seen many abuses, that ended up first into cynicism, second into dogmatism, and third into horrific instrumentalization. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto Gargarella.
Can you hear me? I would surprise if you say no.
Yeah, yes, but it's a bit. You need to speak up a bit.
Hello. Okay. No, in my understanding of democracy, it has at least two components that need to be honored. One is, I would say, autonomy, individual autonomy, and the other is collective self-government. And I think that most of the regimes we know have dishonored one of those values or both in the name of the other. So you have that in the name of collective self-government, dishonor individual autonomy. And then you have, I would say, conservative liberal regimes, like, I don't know, the United States or many of our countries, that in the name of individual autonomy, they dishonor the principle of collective self-government. So they make it very difficult for the collective conversation. So I think that a proper democratic regime needs to honor both values, no? So individual autonomy and collective self-government, and not sacrifice one in the name of the other. That's what we normally do. In the worst cases, authoritarian regimes sacrifice both values, no?
Okay, thank you. Would anybody like to add anything? Okay, so thank you very much to everyone, conference speakers and members of the audience for joining us today. We will reconvene tomorrow for 3 additional panels starting from 2 p.m. Israel time. Thank you very much to all. Thanks to the participants.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Ciao, ciao.